if you can go to this website called menti.com and put in this code here, the 85659652, and it asks you to write 2 statements about challenging behaviour, and then we're going to make a start in just a minute. So this is the Introduction to Understanding Behaviour That Challenges webinar. So my name's Owen Lane. I'm a trainee clinical psychologist within the community family psychology team.
And I'm Jordan, and I'm another trainee clinical psychologist within the same team.
So the idea about today is just to give a quick introduction into different areas of behaviour and the sort of models that we use within our team and how those can be applied and taken forward by yourselves. Yeah, and it's just anything else you can think of?
Yeah, I guess just a couple of ground rules. Obviously, this is a webinar, so me and Owen will be doing most of the talking for the day. If you have got any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll try and keep an eye on that and answer questions where we can. Obviously, this is an introduction to understanding behaviour challenges. We're not going to be able to cover everything, and we're also not in a position to offer kind of a specific individual advice. This is more of a kind of general overview. So just to be mindful about what information you might be sharing. Obviously, this is a confidential space, but just be mindful of any information that you're sharing. But yeah, so any questions, please pop them in the chat. If there's any problems, if you can't see anything or things aren't working, just give us a shout and we'll try and fix it as soon as we can.
And also, if some of the stuff we do talk about today is around behaviour and it might feel quite relevant to yourself, and that might bring up a lot of difficult emotions for yourself as well. So if you find it difficult to sit through this at times, feel free to just take a break for yourself and go grab a cup of tea, coffee, glass of water, anything else, like have a bit of a break from the screen. We'll have a few breaks during this time as well, but just make sure you look after your own well-being as well.
So this is just a brief overview of what we'll be covering over the next 2 hours. So we're going to be starting with a bit of an introduction to understanding what behaviours that challenge are and thinking about why they might occur. Then we're going to have a little bit of a break. And then on coming back, we'll be thinking a little bit more about kind of the strategies for managing and responding to challenging behaviour, what sort of things we might suggest that parents can do. Then we'll take another quick break, and then we'll just be coming back to think a little bit about kind of self-care and looking after yourselves, because that's really, really important when looking after or supporting children with behaviours that challenge. So that's just a brief overview, and I think we're going to get started now.
Yep. So once again, I'm going to ask you to go to this site called menti.com and put in that same code, and hopefully it should give you the option to just type in some different options about what you think, what behaviours you find challenging personally. If I move this along. So what I'll do is once people have seen that code and gone to that website, I'll start showing it, and they should appear as a bit of a word bubble. But these can be any sort of behaviours at all, and it doesn't have to be what other people find challenging. It's more about what you find personally challenging. So as people type in any sort of words or anything like that, it should pop up. If it's not working for anyone, just pop that in the chat and see what we can do. There we are. So we've got a few there. So we've got things like getting distracted, which I think can be challenging for lots of people, even for us. Like as adults, if someone gets distracted halfway through us talking to them or something like that, that can be really difficult to manage. The same as not listening as well, falls in the same sort of category. And we've also got screeching there. So thank you for sharing those.
Mm-hmm. You can enter as many or as few as you need to, just having a bit of think about what behaviours you might deal with on a day-to-day basis that you might find challenging. And there's a whole range of behaviours.
Mm-hmm. We'll give it a couple of minutes for allow people to like access the site and put in some options there. So you've got a hit in there as well, which might be a really common one that we hear about a lot. As the that might be the first thing that comes to mind when people think about behaviours that might be challenging. We've got a few more there. We've got avoidance, unexpected outbursts, and high anxiety and high fear, and screaming as well. So screaming and screeching are two really common ones there.
Yeah. And you can really see the kind of variety in behaviours that we might see from, I guess, some of the more traditional behaviours that challenge, so hitting out, so that more physical stuff, and screaming, screeching, but also things like I said, really high anxiety, which actually on the surface might not seem as something that's challenging, but on a day-to-day basis, if you're trying to manage that within your family and supporting your child to access the community or to go to school, actually that's something that can be really, really difficult. Yeah, screaming again, looks like a popular one, hurting siblings.
That fits with what you're just saying there around trying to support your family at the same time as trying to support the child who might be displaying these behaviours, and trying to balance that and trying to make sure that everyone stays safe is just a really difficult thing to do and must be really challenging at that time. So it's really useful to see those there. If anyone's got any more, feel free to share them, or we might just move on, if that's all right. But those are really good things to think about together, and a really good range. We've got a few more there. So we've got things like lying, stealing, door slamming, swearing. Some of those are really, really common things like swearing we see all the time, and that's might be one of the things that comes to mind as like a typical sort of behaviour that people find challenging. But then think about lying and trying to determine when that's happening as well. And trying to support the individual, the child with that, and then stealing and door slamming. So as John was saying, there's a huge range here that might be very, very different for each child or each person we're thinking about here today. So it's really good to have that variation there. So we'll go back to the slides.
So to start off, we're just going to have a bit of a think. We're going to ask you to think about a time where you might have shown some challenging behaviour, and you can just have a little reflection on this, think to yourself about time this might have happened, and have a little look through those questions and kind of ask yourself what might have happened in all those different steps. And also, I'm going to tell you about a time when I displayed some challenging behaviour, and Owen's going to ask me a couple of questions about that. So shall I just give a bit of an overview of what happened, or do you want to start with the questions?
So tell us what the actual behaviour looked like, and then we can work through the questions from there.
Okay, so it would have looked like, so I guess I have to give a little bit of context. I was going into work, and I would have been outside the office front door, and I would have been very frustrated. I would have been shouting. I would have been probably swearing, to be honest. Probably kicked the door as well. Just generally probably having what looked like a tantrum outside of the front door of my office.
So you can think about those behaviours that people identified earlier, and a few of those were coming up for you. Things like swearing, hitting out,
shouting,
maybe even some screaming in there as well.
Probably, yeah.
So think about these questions then. What happened leading up to that behaviour?
Well, I think it was probably a Monday. I feel like it was the start of the week. And I was actually presenting something similar to this to a staff team. So I tried to get in super early so that I could print off lots of resources and handouts, because this was pre-COVID. So I had left for work early so that I could get in. But it was super, super bad weather. It was tipping it down with rain, and there was loads of traffic as a result. So I actually ended up getting to the office not as early as I wanted to be. So I was already feeling pretty frustrated at this point, because my day just wasn't really going to plan. I had a lot to do. And then I walked down to the office door, and I was still the first one there. And I put my key in the front door, and I turned it, and the key snapped in the lock. And as I've told you about what happened then, my head just flipped, and I started shouting, I started swearing. I was just so frustrated. I probably kicked the door because I just literally could not believe that my only key to the office had snapped and was now stuck in the lock.
So we have a good understanding there of like what happened and like the big lead up to it. So, and we know what you actually did there as well. So then we want to think about what happened afterwards.
Well, that probably went on for a couple of minutes. I'd say actually the hitting out the door probably didn't last very long. That was probably only like once or twice. The swearing probably lasted a little bit longer. I probably was under my breath, just swearing quite a lot, that I couldn't believe this had happened. Because it was raining as well, I think I ended up going back to my car and then trying to call other members of people who'd be coming to the office, asking when they would be in, but they were all coming to work on time. So I ended up just having to wait in my car and ended up just running late the whole day.
So we have an idea of what happened afterwards as well there. So think about the actual behaviour, that screaming, that hitting the door, that swearing, shouting. Why did you do what you did?
I think it was just complete frustration at the situation. I wasn't able to get to the things that I needed to be able to do my job. So I was just really, really frustrated, had all these emotions and just completely flipped my lid about it. And yeah, not being able to get into the office and get all the things that I needed in order to be ready for the day. So yeah, a couple of things going on there, I think.
So we have that idea around that build of a frustration really just getting to be too much. It was one thing after another, and it became overwhelming at that point. So what sort of need was that meeting when you did, like, as you say, flipped your lid?
I guess some of it was trying to bring my emotions back down, actually, because I was just seeing red and I just couldn't think straight. So part of it was just trying to get all of that frustration out. I guess also part of it, probably kicking the door. There was probably a small part of me that thought maybe I can just kick the door down and I can get into the office and get what I need. Obviously not a very helpful strategy.
Yeah. So we have an idea then of like that needs being met around it, just discharging all of that like frustration and hoping amongst all hope that actually you can get through that door. So what sort of resources and skills did you use to help you come to this understanding of why you did this behaviour?
Well, I think for me, having time and space to kind of calm down afterwards helped me reflect on what had happened and actually think about the fact that wasn't a very helpful strategy in that moment. It didn't get me into the office any quicker. It didn't get me to what I wanted. I was fortunate that I had that time to be able to reflect on it, and eventually people came to my rescue with a key for the office. We were able to luckily get the bit snapped in the lock out. We were able to get in, and I was able to generally kind of get on with my day to the best of its ability. But yeah, it was having that time and that option to reflect on what had happened and realizing actually in the heat of the moment that wasn't the most helpful strategy.
So we can see from this example that Jordan's given us that actually behaviours or challenging behaviour happens to all of us. So it might happen when we might be speeding in our car, or we might be like, the car's always a great thing to think about as well. It's like we might be cut up and start swearing at the car in front of us. But it happens to all of us. And actually we typically have more resources and more skills to manage some of these behaviours and have a better understanding of what's going on and why we are acting the way we are. But some of your children who might be displaying these behaviours might not have those same resources and might not have those same skills, and actually rely on you as parents to help bring them back down and help them to understand that, which can be really tricky because actually you have to get inside the mind of your child to understand what need it was meeting and why they did what they did, and what led up to it, which might seem really ambiguous at times.
And that's really difficult because if we think back to the example that I gave of when the actual behaviour was happening, the swearing, the shouting, the kicking at the door, if someone had just been walking down the street at that point and saw me, they probably thought, what the heck's going on with this girl? Like, what's wrong with her? Why is she trying to break into this office? The understanding they would have had of what was going on would have been really, really limited because they only would have seen the behaviour. They wouldn't have seen the lead up, everything that had contributed to that behaviour. They wouldn't understand all the things that had been going on inside my head. So it's really difficult actually to be able to get that understanding to figure out what's been going on in terms of leading to a behaviour, and also what happens after that might make that behaviour keep happening. Because I guess, for example, if actually when I kicked the door, if it had opened, well, then that might have become something that I might have done a bit more of in the future. If I knew actually if I just give the door a good kick, it's going to open, I can get in, I can get my day sorted. That might be a strategy that I might rely on more in the future. Obviously, in the case that I spoke about, it wasn't a very helpful strategy, and I did do the better thing of just calming down and waiting for someone to come and help. But it's just that snapshot of symptoms of behaviour. There's all this other stuff going on as well.
Yeah. So we're going to come on to now think about what about when people behave in ways that are challenging and what that looks like, and also think about why the behavior might be happening itself. So we like to refer to it as the iceberg of behaviors. So the very tip, as Jordan was saying, is what we see. So as someone walking past Jordan, they'd have seen the screaming, the shouting, the swearing, the kicking, but what they wouldn't have seen is the meaning behind the behavior and the lead up, everything that led up to that point. So that's what we want to think about today, because we're all probably able to very easily see the behavior itself, but actually identifying what happened beforehand and what might be causing that behavior and the meaning behind it is a lot more difficult.
And taking the iceberg analogy a bit further, said you've given some really good examples of what we might see on the surface of behaviors that are challenging. So self-harm, I'm actually not sure if that was one that had come up, but that's one that we do often see. So that might be things like head banging or biting, pinching, as well as sometimes we might see things like cutting. Obviously aggression, that had come up, so hurting siblings, hitting out, avoiding demands. Someone mentioned about avoidance, so those are all really good examples of some of the stuff that we might see on the surface. But in terms of what might be going on underneath, those are the things that take a bit more time to unpick and to discover. But it could be things like there might be difficulties in understanding emotions. So if you find it really hard to understand your own emotions, you might react in ways that aren't particularly helpful. Trying to make or keep friends, that can be really difficult for people. Being confused by expectations, if you actually don't know what you're being asked to do, that can be really, really difficult and might lead to challenging behaviour, an attempt maybe to avoid that thing or to get out of the place because you don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes it can be simply just not understanding what's going on, and that can be really, really difficult. So someone had mentioned earlier about high anxiety, and we do see that a lot with some of the young people that we support, of this just kind of baseline level of anxiety being quite high just on a day-to-day basis. And that can make it so much easier to kind of lead to behaviours that challenge, because that anxiety is just so high and really hard that it can just become overwhelming when something happens, which that is that next bit there about being overwhelmed by day-to-day life, things happening that are just too much for a young person to cope with and don't have the resources and skills to communicate that in a different way or help someone understand, I'm really overwhelmed and I need help to feel less overwhelmed. So instead we get the behaviours that challenge. And what we'll be thinking about, I guess, over the course of today is how we can help young people with all this stuff under the surface, how we can meet those needs, how we can help them feel less anxious, how we can help them understand, emotions, which hopefully should reduce the need to kind of engage in those behaviours that challenge, because we've helped them deal with all that stuff that's going on underneath the surface.
Yeah, and this is just a quick snapshot. Obviously, we've identified way more of those behaviours that we see, but there's also way more that's underneath the surface. And we understand it's really challenging that when you're trying to support a child who's displaying some of these behaviours, to take a step back to see what's underneath the surface. So that's what hopefully we're going to help with today, is to help make that a bit easier. So going to talk a bit about what we call the ABC model of human behaviour. So it starts off with the antecedent. So it's a bit of a technical term that they just use basically to fit it into this ABC to make it quite nice. But essentially it's what happens before the behavior itself. It's looking at the build-up. It's looking at the things like the triggers, what caused the behavior to happen. And when we think about triggers, we can think about fast triggers. So that might be being told to do something that you don't really want to do. In Jordan's example, the fast trigger would be the key snapping in the door. So something that happens immediately before the behavior that triggers everything to go and to escalate a bit. But then we want to think about also slow triggers. These are things that are in the background that we don't always see straight away. So think about Jordan's example once again. The slow trigger would be running late, it raining, being stuck in traffic in the car as well. And these are all things that have happened well before that seem quite low level that we might miss and might not think about. Other examples might just be like being hungry, might be being really tired, being ill, being too hot or too cold, those sort of things. And then the behavior. So this is what other people see. This is what we've already spoken about. And this is also the way that people get their needs met as well. So as Jordan said, if she had kicked the door and it opened, next time she was struggling to get in the door, she might have just kicked it again because it's the easiest way of getting in, rather than trying to fiddle with a lock that doesn't always work. So what we see a lot of times as well is that children use the same ideas. So actually they might display a behaviour that will get their needs met. So if they hit out, they might get that time to have that time of connection with someone else, or might get some time alone or some quiet time and things like that. And then the consequence at the end, this is how people respond to that behaviour. And this can be either positive or negative. So an idea of a positive response when someone displays behaviour is that they'll actually get that time with an individual, like one-to-one time, and get that connection that they really need at that point. They might even get a chance to have a cuddle, or even just some time alone, maybe, to have some quiet space where they might not be disturbed by other people. But then a negative consequence might be that person gets told off, because we don't really want people to display these behaviours all the time. So we can see that this is what we call the ABC model. We'll come back to this a few times as we go through today.
And I guess just picking up on what Owen said about that, getting needs met and that kind of why that behaviour. We tend to think about every behaviour having a function, and in terms of understanding that function and why that behaviour, we tend to kind of think about 4 broad categories of why someone might be engaging in that particular behaviour, particularly ones that are challenging. So you can use a little acronym called SEAT to remember this, and that stands for sensory, escape, attachment, and tangible. And I'll just kind of go through what those mean in detail. And also this isn't every function that there is, but this is what we kind of see as general broad categories. And this will be different for every young person, depends on their needs, depends on what the functions of their behaviour is and what's going on for them. So thinking about sensory, so that might be a behaviour, something that feels good, or something, so for example, some people might have a real sensory need and might engage in head banging because actually they really enjoy the sensations that they get from that really repetitive hitting of their head against a wall. Even though that's a really challenging behaviour, they're getting real sensory good feedback from that. But it also could be actually, they might have a headache, they might have a pain in their head that they're trying to relieve by banging their head against a wall because they don't have the ability to communicate to you, I've got a headache, and they don't know how to get rid of it. Often when if we're wondering if behaviour has a sensory function, then we would kind of expect to see that at any point, even when the person is alone. In terms of thinking about other functions, so there's escape. So often this is using behaviour that challenges to kind of get rid of or avoid something that's unpleasant or that you don't understand. So that might be knowing that if you shout and scream and someone takes you away from a party or going to school, then that's a really good way of getting your needs met. And you know that actually, if I scream, I'm going to have to leave school, which I really don't like because I find it stressful or it makes me anxious. And we see it that actually someone might engage in this when things are really hard. Also sometimes when they're really easy, actually some children find being bored really, really difficult or being understimulated. So they might start engaging in a behaviour that challenges to get out of that situation because actually they're just feeling really bored. Also, if things are scary or anxiety provoking, again, we might see some of these behaviours that challenge in a way of escaping from that situation or avoiding it in the first place. And this third one is attachment. And originally this would have been described as attention, but I guess we feel like that can sometimes have quite a negative connotation to it. So it says that can look like attention seeking. Whereas really we see this more as trying to seek access to people and interactions, to connect with people, to have that social interaction, those really close attachments that they've got to the people around them. And we'll often see this when someone needs social interaction. So it's not a negative thing. It's actually they're trying to get your attention so that they can connect to you and they can have that interaction that's really important to them. And then finally, the kind of fourth function that we might think about is tangible. And this means getting access to something tangible. So getting an item or getting an activity. And this might again happen if things are really difficult, if things are easy, if they're bored, or if they're scared. So actually, if someone knows that if I start hitting out, someone's going to give me my iPad and then I can watch videos, then I might keep engaging in that. Similarly, I know someone might say, if I actually refuse to leave this place and then someone's going to give me a chocolate bar in order to get me to leave, you're probably going to keep doing that because you're getting the thing that you want. So we said, those are often just the way that someone can get their needs met currently, and they don't have perhaps the skills to help meet that need in another way. And what we'll think about as we go on is what other ways we could perhaps meet those needs so that someone doesn't need to engage in those behaviours. So if something sensory, how can we help meet that sensory need without resorting to headbanging, for example?
And then that brings us on to the next idea of understanding your child's brain. And we've used the term flipping your lid a few times already. So give a bit of background. We know that our brains continue developing and won't stop developing until we're about the age of 25. And during that time of development, different skills are developed in different times. So I'm sure we can all think back to when we were children and how we've acted completely different to how we are now as adults. And we know that emotional regulation skills only begin to develop around age 9, but they can develop much later or a little bit earlier, depends on the child. But it's around that age that we start to see that children are able to regulate their own emotions. And even when they regulate their own emotions, they still depend on you to help them to learn about their emotions and how to respond to them. So there's a lot of reliance on parents to actually be that emotional regulation person and to help talk their child through and help them to develop that understanding. And we have this really amazing picture on the right-hand side, created by someone called Dan Siegel, and it's about this upstairs and downstairs brain. And we think of the upstairs brain as that our thinking skills and our body control and our play and our empathy, and it's where we make all those like really difficult decisions about our life. Think about making a decision about like what we want to eat or anything like that, and understanding other people's emotions at that time, or even our own emotions. Whereas the downstairs brain, this is more of our ancestral brain. This has been developed just to keep us alive and keep us surviving, essentially. So in our downstairs brain, we have like our breathing, it keeps our heart beating, our eyes open and things like that. But it also controls our fight or flight, which people might have heard of. So when we feeling anxious or recognize that there might be a danger or feeling scared in our own environment, our body goes into this fight or flight response, where it pumps loads of adrenaline around our body and gets us ready to either run as fast away from this scary thing as we can, or to fight it off in some way. And what often happens is that when we are feeling distressed, or when children are feeling distressed and dysregulated, they can flip their lid, essentially splitting that upstairs and downstairs brain, and that only their downstairs brain is working and keeping them alive and keeping them surviving. That means they don't have access to a lot of those thinking skills, a lot of those body control skills, a lot of those understanding emotions of other people's or themselves, or their ability to play or anything like that. And they actually rely on their parents then to act as their upstairs brain and to help them make that connection and help them regulate themselves and bring themselves back down to a state where they can understand and can get back to that thinking.
And I think that's something we can all relate to. I bet we've all experienced what we, might describe as a red mist coming down on us, where you can't think straight, you can't rationalize what's going on, you're just acting on your feelings. And this is exactly the same sort of thing that happens. It's like that part of your brain just goes, I'm offline, I've just got this emotional bit of my brain that's driving what I'm doing. And for some of the children that we're going to be working with who've got a learning disability, we know, so it says here about emotion regulation skills developing around age 9. Well, actually, for children who've got a developmental delay or who are not at a developmental stage that matches their age, Some of these skills might take a lot longer to develop. So you might be having to do some of this stuff for children who are a lot older, because it's going to take time for those skills to develop. Or some of those skills might always be really, really difficult for that child because of their learning disability. And I think on the next slide, we have a video that's going to explain this concept in a much probably better way than we have. So we're just gonna,
I think I need to stop sharing. Oh wait, share sound.
we're gonna watch this and then take a break.
Yeah, so we'll watch this video. She does a way better job than either of us have done about explaining that that model about the brain, and then we'll have a 15-minute break afterwards to grab yourself a cup of tea, coffee, and just a bit of a break from watching the screen all the time as well.
And let us know in the chat if you can hear this.
Hi, I'm Anita, and I'm here today to talk to you about your brain. So our brains are up here inside our heads. You might know that already.
Oh no. We'll try that again.
Hi, I'm Anita, and I'm here today to talk to you about your brain. So our brains are up here inside our heads. You might know that already. And they're really important parts of our body because they help us to move, to talk, to think, and do lots of really important things. They send messages all around our body and receive messages coming in from our body as well. Okay, so I'm going to pretend that my hand is my brain. Okay, so imagine that this hand has just sort of come out of my head here, and this is my spine, my back coming up into the bottom bit of my brain, and this is the top bit of my brain here that just sits behind my eyes. Okay, and I want to talk to you about some parts of our brain that help us and cause problems with our emotions. Okay, so inside our brain here, this bottom bit of our brain coming up here is called our brain stem, and we share this part of our brain with reptiles, with lizards. Okay, and it's in control, or it helps us with really important functions like breathing, heartbeat, our blood pressure. It keeps us alive. It's also involved in something called the fight, flight and freeze response. Okay, so it's connected to a bit in the middle of our brain, which is like an alarm bell. Okay, so when we see something that's scary or think something that's scary, this alarm bell goes off in our brain, and we will have a fight, flight, so we might want to run, or freeze, we just stay still, response, reaction to whatever caused us that fear. Now, this response we're not in control of. So one of the reasons I want to share this information about our brain with you is to help you not to feel so scared of this fight, flight and freeze response. It just happens. Our brains are wired that way. It's automatic. And it's designed to protect us, to keep us safe. The problem is now we don't always need to fight, flight or freeze when something happens. And everyone goes into that fight, flight and freeze response for different reasons. So sometimes it might be something outside, external to us, like a scary noise, like a hand dryer or a car alarm or a loud voice that makes us go into that fight, flight and freeze. Or sometimes it might be something inside us, like a thought or a worry. I can't do this. This is too hard. And it can make us do something which we call flip our lids. So I said this bit of our brain which sits here is really important, because this bit of our brain, the lid of our brain, helps us to think, to speak, to solve problems. So if that alarm bell inside our brain has gone off and we've flipped our lid, we can't solve problems very easily. So instead of talking or telling someone how you're feeling or what you need, you fight, you run away, or you freeze. Okay? So the reason that I'm sharing this with you is because I think it's really important for us all to do a few things. One, try and work out what makes you flip your lid, okay? So go through and make a list of things that make you flip your lid, where no one can talk to you, you can't hear them, you're in survival mode and you just need to feel safe, okay? And number two, what helps you not flip your lid, and what helps you calm down once you have flipped your lid, okay? And just before we finish, I've got some ideas, because the things that help people to not flip their lid or make their lid come back down again when they have flipped their lid is going to be different for lots of different people. But two really important ideas that lots of scientists have shown really help is one, connection. So that might be a cuddle with someone who cares for you, or talking to someone who cares for you, just feeling safe with another person. And two is breathing, slowing our breathing down, because when that lizard is activated, our breathing can get really short and shallow. So if we breathe in through our nose, pause, and breathe out really slowly through our mouth. We might bring that lid back down and start very slowly to feel safe again. We're convincing that lizard that it's safe, that it doesn't need to worry. Okay? I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you've got any questions, try and ask a parent or someone who cares for you what any of the words mean, or to explain it a little bit more for you. Okay, thanks very much for watching. Bye-bye.
So hopefully that was a good explanation of what we were just discussing about flipping our lids. And I think now is a good time to just take a bit of a short break. So if you want to take about 15 minutes, I said go stretch your legs, have a drink, just have some time away from the screen. So if we say we come back at about 5 to 11, yeah, that's about right. If you have any questions for us on anything that's come up so far, feel free to pop them in the chat and we can answer them when we get back. If not, have a nice break and we'll see you at about 5 to 11.
Thanks.
So we hope that you had a good break, able to have a drink, get away from the screen for a little bit. So we're just going to be coming back now to think a little bit more about the behaviours that challenge, and I guess getting on to probably the main bit, which is how do we think about managing behaviours that challenge. So the first thing that we're going to start with, which is I guess a helpful framework when we think about how we might manage behaviours that challenge, something that we refer to as the behaviour volcano. And as you can kind of see, it's kind of on a scale. So down the bottom, we have kind of like this baseline, which I guess is where we all feel calm, engaged, kind of in control, feel regulated, and ideally that's where we would all like to stay. But we all know that actually that doesn't happen. And what happens is something might trigger us. So we talked a little bit about slow and fast triggers earlier. So something might happen that brings us a little bit off baseline. So some of those slow triggers might be something like not having good sleep, or the weather not being particularly nice, maybe it's too hot. It might be feeling anxious about something that's coming up, so it could be about an event or a time of year, seasons changing actually for some people can be something that just triggers anxiety or makes them feel unsettled or brings up memories of things they don't like, or for example thinking of Christmas. It's a time of year where everything starts getting a bit busier and there's lots of things going on, there's lots of sounds, there's lots of noise, there's lots of lights, and from a sensory perspective it can feel quite overwhelming. So those are all things that might just bring someone off that baseline. So they're starting to travel up this kind of volcano, as we've put it. So that's thinking about that number two there, those sort of triggers. And then what we often see is there might be that fast trigger. So thinking about that kind of number three. that is something that really just kind of escalates up into that behaviour. So we see that challenging behaviour might be starting, there might be kind of these early warning signs that someone is moving away from that baseline, and feeling more distressed and feeling more dysregulated. And thinking about those fast triggers, some of the ones we mentioned, they can be things like having a demand, so being asked to do something, or being told, no, you can't do something. It might be said going somewhere that you really don't like, so that might be going to school, or going out into the community, going to a shop. So there's all those things that really start to kind of escalate that behaviour upwards until we kind of hit that number 4, which is basically that crisis point. So that is where the behaviour, it's at its absolute peak, at its intensity, severity. Things are really, really challenging at that point. And what we do at all of these different points, what we might do when someone's on baseline versus when someone is escalating versus when someone is at crisis point, there'll be different strategies for all of those different points. And we'll think about that in a little bit more detail as we go on through this webinar. So obviously we can only stay in that kind of elevated state of dysregulation for a certain period of time, because all the adrenaline that's going through your body, that can't go on forever. Our bodies eventually become exhausted, and that does start to decline. And generally we might just see someone start to come back down, but also what you might see is actually if the wrong strategy to manage that behavior is used, or there's another trigger, someone might start to escalate back up. So you might see, instead of just this kind of curve up, you might see someone kind of go up, come down, go back up again, come down. It's going to be really variable for every child and young person that we work with, because it all depends on what's going on for that young person. And as someone is starting to come down after an incident of behaviour that challenges, sometimes we even see what we refer to as a post-incident dip. So this is where someone even drops below kind of where their baseline level of being calm and engaged is. And that might be where someone's feeling really, really sad, or feeling really withdrawn, feeling really, really sorry. And what someone needs at that point, again, is going to be really different. Some people might just need time to process what's happened. Others might need that connection. They might need a hug. They might need time to talk. They might need someone to go through the situation with them. And then hopefully they'll kind of come back to that baseline. And this is just an example of kind of one incident of a behaviour that challenges. As we said, this actually isn't always as straightforward as just kind of coming up and coming down. But in general, it just helps us think about the different kind of stages of a behaviour that challenges. And what we'll go on to think about is the strategies that we might use to manage behaviours that challenge at all of these different points.
So if we think about Jordan's example earlier of when she displayed behaviours that sort of could be seen as challenging. So number 1 would be her baseline. So when she woke up, how her sleep was. And then number 2 is when she got in the car, it started raining. She started to then like hit some traffic. So you can see it slowly but surely like escalating and getting more distressed. And then around this point is where the key breaks in the door, and Jordan escalated all the way to number 4, where she's flipped her lid. All of that behavior is then displayed, that shouting, the swearing, the kicking the door. Then after a few minutes, Jordan then managed to use her skills to have a breather, to relax herself, to take a step away, and you can see it coming back down. And what might have happened is that when she phoned the team that she's working with, and they said they weren't going to be there for a while, chances are these behaviors like had a little extra peak, and a bit more swearing comes out, a bit more frustration. And then being sat in the car waiting for them, you see her come all the way back down, possibly to a bit of a post-incident dip, being like, why did I do that? Why did I kick the door? There's no need for that. And then coming back up to baseline for the rest of the day.
So hopefully that example helps you kind of get an idea of what that can look like, and you can just have a bit of a think about whether you recognize that pattern with your own child's behavior, and whether that's something that you've kind of identified before. That's a really good point, Lynette, that you mentioned about going from kind of 1 to 4 and then back down really, really, really fast. And that's something that said the speed at which someone can kind of go from that baseline up to that crisis point can be really, really quick. For other people, it can take a really long time, and someone might build up all day and then eventually reach that point. So it's really about understanding what maybe some of those early warning signs might be for your child. Are there any indications that they might just be coming a little bit away from baseline, so that you can kind of intervene before they hit to that crisis point?
And actually, as we see here, baseline is often affected by things like our sleep, be it by like illness, by different events and environmental changes. So what might be is that for most of us, our baseline's all the way down here, right at the bottom. And actually it's a long way to get to the top, and it's going to take a lot of time to get there. But for some children, their baseline might be all the way up here, essentially. And it only takes something very, very small to bring them off baseline, and to that number 4, it's only a short distance, which may take a short amount of time. And that might explain why then she comes back down to baseline really, really quickly as well. So as John said, it's all about understanding what's going on, what maybe those slow triggers that we don't always recognize are, and what some of those early warning signs are. And we'll come on to that in a bit, and hopefully to develop a bit of understanding for all of us about what some of those triggers are for us. So we've spoken a bit about so far about what some of the challenging behaviours might look like. So we've spoken a bit, some of the ideas everyone said earlier, the screaming, shouting, avoiding things, not listening, sometimes lying. There's lots of different types of these behaviours that we see that might be really challenging for us. And then we thought a bit together about what function do these behaviours serve. So thinking about that seat, sensory, attachment, tangible, and
Escape.
Escape is the other one, also get the E. So we have an idea of what those functions are and how they affect children. So the next stage then is thinking about, what is a more helpful way of getting that need met? So as we said earlier, the idea is that the behaviours are often used as a way of getting children's needs met, and they're often the easiest way of getting that need met at the moment in time. But hopefully we can develop an understanding of a different way of getting that need met. It'll be a lot easier and a lot less distressing for both for families and parents, but also for the children themselves as well. So we're now going to show you another video. And this is all around this idea of PBS, which is a positive behaviour support. So we'll watch it and then we'll have a little conversation about it and around how we can implement that in our own lives as well. Let us know if you can't hear it.
All behaviour happens for a reason, and challenging behaviour is no different. Challenging behaviour makes life more difficult for the person doing it and those around them. Challenging behaviour takes many forms. It might involve someone hurting themselves, hurting other people, being aggressive, or anything else that has a serious impact on an individual's day-to-day life. Often this is dealt with by using temporary solutions, short-term fixes that don't actually address why the behaviour is happening. They may make the behaviour worse, and they can have a significant impact on quality of life. Some people prefer to call it positive behavioural support to remind us of the important fact that it comes from the scientific understanding of behaviour. You may hear people call it positive behaviour support, and it's usually called PBS for short. Although challenging behaviours can be difficult and distressing for all, they're often the most effective way an individual currently has to get their needs met. PBS aims to find the meaning behind a person's behaviour and then help them to find other ways to achieve what they want. PBS is a framework for working out why challenging behaviour gets a person's needs met, and then finding better ways for this to happen. PBS uses the techniques of applied behaviour analysis, guided by a strong values base and delivered in person-centred ways. That means around the individual and their unique needs. In working out why there is challenging behaviour, PBS specialists involve the person, their carers, their family and the staff who support them. Working together, they use scientific ways of collecting information to understand what the purpose of the behaviour is. As part of this, they would check whether the person had health problems that were causing them pain or discomfort. Once they know the why, they use the information and data to design a positive behaviour support plan. A PBS plan will be different for each person and will be based on what we think the behaviour means. It means that everybody knows the best way to work together to support the person. The main part of the plan will include some strategies for avoiding things that distress the person, as well as plans to teach them better and less harmful ways of getting their needs met. It usually involves teaching someone new skills so they can do more things for themselves, or some better ways to communicate. It may have plans to teach them coping strategies so they can learn to cope better in the future with situations that are difficult for them. It will also have some ideas to support the person if they do start to become upset. These are things that help to make them feel better at the time. The plan will also have clear guidance so everybody knows what to do if things become unsafe for the person or others around them. These strategies will only be used if absolutely necessary to keep everybody safe at that time. A PBS plan will also have ideas to improve the person's everyday life and feelings of well-being. Information will be collected over a set period of time to see if the plan is working. Hopefully, the quality of life for the person will be improving. If it isn't, the specialist will try and find out why. It's estimated that less than 20% of those who would benefit from this type of support are actually receiving it. Many believe PBS is the most ethical form of support for those displaying challenging behaviours. It has a growing evidence base that it works. There are 10 key components of PBS, divided into values, theory, and process, how it actually works. 1. It's about improving the quality of life of the person and of those around them. 2. It works by developing and building skills and not by punishing people or behaviour. 3. Practitioners work in partnership with the person and those people who are important to them. 4. All behaviour is for a reason, and challenging behaviour is no different. 5. PBS primarily uses applied behaviour analysis to describe, predict and change behaviour. 6. Other complementary evidence-based approaches may be included in PBS plans, such as occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, and other psychological therapies where these support changes in behaviour. 7. PBS uses decisions based on facts and research, not opinions or hearsay. 8. A formal assessment is made to create a clear, structured plan of action. What practitioners do is directly informed by what they know about the individual. 9. A PBS plan should tell people what to do to proactively prevent the challenging behaviour from happening and manage it well reactively if it does. 10. And above all, it should make sure people are actively supported over the long term to maintain their quality of life. PBS has been shown to help people with a wide range of needs and to cover a wide range of behaviours. It is an evidence-based approach. By using PBS, we believe we've found a better way for the individual, for families, for carers and for those who provide services. PBS is a respectful and ethical approach and supports people's dignity. If you're interested in learning more, please visit www.build.org.uk.
But there's just a quick introduction into PBS that we're going to expand on a bit further now, but we think that's a really lovely video and it gives the main overview of positive behaviour support in a really short, brief video.
And I guess why we talk about positive behaviour support is because in our team, so the community family psychology team, it's probably the predominant framework through which we work through, and it's really the lens through which we think about behaviour and think about strategies that might be helpful for the families that we support. And as we said, PBS is a framework, so it gives us these ideas, but when we're working with a family, we're always thinking about what is going on for that person individually, thinking about their likes and dislikes, their strengths, what their triggers might be, what the skills that they have. So it's always based on the unique needs of that person. And I guess the aim of PBS is about really understanding that behaviour based on that assessment that we do of everything that's going on in the child's kind of social life and the environment around the child, and really helping get everyone involved in that child's life and kind of included in the plan. So we want to hear from parents, we want to hear from school, we want to hear from any other professionals or anyone else that's involved in kind of being part of that child's system. All their perspectives are really, really important to get an understanding of what's going on, how we can support everybody. And we use this information then to kind of come up with a plan of strategies and kind of things that might help manage that behaviour and make it easier for everyone kind of around the child. And most importantly, it's about enhancing the child's quality of life and helping them build up skills. It's not about punishment. It's about helping them to be happier, to be hurting themselves less, for everyone around the child to be feeling less stressed, better able to manage things, to be more engaged in community activities in school. And yeah, really quality of life is the ultimate goal of what we aim to work through and address using PBS. And we mentioned about kind of developing this PBS plan once we've kind of done our assessment and once we've got our understanding of what is going on for that person and the people around them. We kind of come up with some of the strategies, the things that can help with behaviours that challenge. And this is kind of split up into 3 areas, which we'll go through in a little bit more detail now. But there's what we call primary prevention strategies. And these make up a real good majority of a PBS plan. It says here about kind of 90%. And this is really about how we help keep people on baseline, because if we can keep people at baseline and kind of get rid of some of those triggers and things that make them escalate, then we don't need those strategies for when someone hits crisis point, because they're going to stay on baseline and they're going to be calm and engaged. So the majority of our work goes into thinking about how we can help that child meet the needs that they're gaining through challenging behaviour at a much more helpful and adaptive way. So thinking about those real day-to-day things that might be kind of understanding what those triggers are and thinking about how we can avoid them, or providing things that they might be trying to gain through challenging behaviour. The second part of the plan thinks about what we call secondary prevention strategies. So if we could imagine that behaviour volcano, the primary prevention is for all this stuff at the bottom, the baseline. The secondary prevention is kind of this escalation stage. So as people are kind of starting to come up off baseline, those slow and fast triggers, it's kind of this point here, they've not quite got to crisis point. It's this kind of escalation phase is where the secondary prevention strategies come in. So that kind of thinks about things like how we help people calm, how we help them bring that lid back down before it's kind of flipped all the way off, and think of things like maybe redirection and distraction. And also things like playfulness and humour can work really well at this point as well. And then at the top, at that crisis point, we have what are known as your reactive strategies. And these are things that we have to do to keep your child, to keep yourself, to keep the people around the child safe. So these might just be things like breakaway. So if there's kind of aggression or harm going on, how can you get out of that safely? And so just making sure the environment around you is safe. But those are really our kind of last resort strategies. And we hope that through having those primary and secondary prevention strategies, it should mitigate the need for those reactive strategies, because we should be able to help a child come back down before reaching that crisis point. But that's not always possible. Sometimes we can do our best to remove as many triggers as possible, to have everything in place, and sometimes that just won't work. And we understand that, and that's why we need those strategies for when things hit crisis point. And I think now what we're going to do is we're just going to think about those kind of 3 areas, because they're quite broad, just in a little bit more detail. And again, we're going to be offering strategies that are kind of generalized. These aren't individual strategies, because actually there's a lot of assessment and a lot of information that goes into developing a PBS plan. So we need all of that understanding before we can get to the strategies point. We're not able to just kind of say, oh, do this or do that, because we really need a good understanding of the child and everything that's going on for the child to do that. So these are just kind of general strategies that might kind of fall under these areas?
So as John said there, the majority of a PBS plan is this primary prevention stage. And this is all about reducing those triggers, whether they be those slow triggers, those environmental things where we're feeling too hot, too cold, tired, under the weather, things like that, as well as those faster triggers. So one of the first things that we typically look at is around communication. So how can we help that young person tell us what's going on for them, and how do we help them tell us if they're not feeling right or if something's bothering them? And so we would think about that together, and we'd also think about like the predictability and routine. So it's got here things like visual timetables, so actually being able to see in front of the child what they've got to do that day, what's coming next. This is the idea of using countdowns. So I know children often really struggle with changing tasks straight away. So actually giving them a bit of a warning of what to change to. And I know I'm personally the same. If someone tells me I have to do something straight away, it often makes me feel a bit annoyed, a bit frustrated. But if someone gives me like, oh, you have to do something in half an hour, I can prepare for that a bit more mentally. I feel a bit better about it. And these are all things in a way that the young person can understand as well. And these are especially important for children who might have autism, because actually routine is really, really important. That predictability is really important, and changing up that routine on the fly can cause people to become really distressed. So that's a really useful thing, a few useful tools to use there. And then think about like the removal of triggers in the environment. So whether things are too hot and too noisy. So I know personally, if I am over the past week, or a few people in our staff team over the past week where it's really, really warm, a lot of people were really, really grumpy because actually being sat in an office or sat being told to do the same work whilst you're sweating and feeling overheated all the time and not be able to manage that yourself actually really bothers us. It means we can't really focus on what we want to do. Or if we haven't had enough sleep, that's like the worst thing for me. If I only had like 4 hours sleep and so I come into work the next day, I am the most grumpy person going, and I won't be able to work as well as I want to, won't be able to think as well as I want to. So these are all useful things to think about, like how can we make sure that if a child's too hot, that they are actually able to have that chance to cool down. Is it cooler inside? Can they spend more time outside? Is there a fan they can use? And then similarly for when it's too noisy, actually, is there a space that they can go to that's a bit quieter, that they can either take themselves to or indicate to you in some way that actually it is a bit too loud, and what they need at that point is to have that time away, have that time where they can have their own thoughts themselves without being distracted by all the other noises going on around them. And then we can think about avoiding too much boredom or too much downtime. So if children are sat there without anything to do, that can often be a time that they might seek out that connection or seek out some of those tangible things, like having their toys or like having an iPad or having an activity to do, just because they have nothing else to do at that time. So linking that back into those visual timetables, think about how you can plan out a day to make sure that children have stuff to do that's not overwhelming, that's not unpredictable as well, and that avoids some of that boredom, that downtime.
And I think it's this part of the plan that really links back to those functions of behaviour that we talked about. So thinking about that SEAT acronym, if we know that actually there's a real big sensory function to someone's behaviours at challenge, the only way they can get their sensory needs met was through that challenging behaviour. Well, how can we help them meet that need in a much better way? So if someone's seeking out that sensory stimulation, let's embed sensory activities throughout their day. So that's meeting their sensory needs, so they don't need to resort to head banging. So we might try and think about what that equivalent might be. So this is where we might link in with, for example, our occupational therapists who've got a really good understanding of a sensory diet. So thinking about all those sensory activities, things that help upregulate a child, so that helps bring them up, but also what things might help bring them down as well when things are getting a bit too much for them. So those are things that we would think about. if we know, for example, that a child is really looking for that attachment, that attention, that social interaction, well, how can we embed that throughout their day so that they have lots of opportunities to seek social interaction and to get that? Can you find time to do shared activities together, to have that shared enjoyment in being together and doing something together? Or how can we help that child ask for that when they need it? Because if they're, for example, if the only way they know they can get a response from you or get attention from you is by hitting themselves or by screaming, instead, if we can teach them a way of communicating that's less hurtful, like if there's a card, or if, for example, if a child uses P.A.C.E, is there something they can do to indicate that they need a hug or they just want 5 minutes with you and for you to be with them? So really thinking about those functions of behaviour is where we'd think about the strategies that are going to go into this part of the plan, helping that child meet their needs in a way that is less harmful and a way that's more adaptive for them, and hopefully teaching them new skills as well as part of this.
And as Jordan said there, that's why we bring in the occupational therapist around that sensory stuff. And then in terms of this communication side of things, that's where speech and language therapists are amazing. They have so many different strategies that can be used and so many ways of like grading that and building that up for all ages and all like cognitive levels. So if a child is struggling to communicate verbally, they might be able to use pictures or objects, or even like maybe things like Makaton or sign language as they get older, if that's a bit easier for them. There's so many different ways of being able to communicate. And it also might be working with parents around understanding those early triggers, as we said earlier, or those early signs of that communication, about how that child is trying to tell you in their own way, without words or without anything else, that they have a need that they'd like to get met at that point. So this is just a brief overview. There's so much more that people can go into, and if it sounds relevant, that some of these strategies are with professionals that can help develop these with alongside parents, alongside the children and other school and other professionals as well.
So then the second part of the plan, which we start to touch upon, is about this secondary prevention stage, which is thinking about when the distress is rising, when someone's starting to escalate away from baseline, when those triggers have come into play, what sort of things can we do at that point? So we said really key to this part of the plan is knowing what those early warning signs are for your child. So what are the signs your child's becoming distressed? What might you see? What might you hear? What might they start doing that just indicates to you that actually they're coming away from baseline? So sometimes this might just be actually the way that your child looks. There might just be a look that you can identify in your child that you're like, actually, I can tell that they're becoming frustrated or they're annoyed. Maybe they become louder, maybe they become quieter, maybe they have particular behaviours, particular tics, particular things that they do when they're starting to become more frustrated. They might start rocking, they might start tapping, they might start hitting. There might be particular things they say when they're becoming frustrated. So really helping getting a good understanding of that and what that looks like already means that we know when to intervene. Instead of letting it go to that crisis point, we're able to intervene before things get there. And some of the strategies that can be helpful at this point is trying to redirect to a preferred activity. So if we know there's something that they really enjoy, trying to kind of redirect them towards that before they get to that point. Thinking about calming techniques. So these can be really important. If we think back to the kind of video about the hand-brain model, they really talked about the importance of breathing and helping to regulate the nervous systems within our body, because it said as we all become anxious, upset, angry, distressed, our breathing does increase. We start to take shorter breaths, take quicker breaths, and that just escalates things further. So it's really important that we're helping children to calm that down and really focusing on breathing and bringing that down. Taking long, deep breaths is a really good way of helping regulate the body, and the mind kind of follows after that. So thinking about ways that you can do this. So blowing bubbles is actually a really good way of doing this, because if you imagine that you've got a bubble wand in front of you, if you take you blow into it really like kind of sharply, quite quickly, it doesn't blow a bubble, it just kind of pops the bubble liquid, I guess. Whereas if you take you purse your lips, you take a long, slow, deep breath out to blow that bubble. And also you kind of get the fun bit of, you get the bubble, something that the child might enjoy. You can do it together, you can take it in turns, you can find laughter in that. But it's also having the added benefit of really making you and the child, because you'll probably be starting to escalate at this point as well, because it's really stressful when you can see your child's becoming dysregulated. It helps bring you both down and calm yourselves down. Kind of mindfulness games or thinking about things that help bring you back to the here and now can be really helpful. So a grounding technique that is used for lots of different difficulties, used for anxiety, is something we call the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. And this is about using your senses to bring you back to the here and now. So when you're getting caught up in all your feelings or what's going on in your body, or things that are going to happen or things that haven't happened, it's about thinking about 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things that you can touch, 2 things you can smell, and I think 1 thing that you can taste. So it's using all those different senses. And you could just focus on kind of what you can see, what you can hear, what you can touch, because they're probably a bit easier to do. And you can almost make it into a game, almost kind of like, tell me what you can see, guessing what they can see, but you're really trying to focus in on what's happening in the here and now, and using those senses to kind of ground a person and bring them back down. Other suggestions there, things like there might be particular calming music or calming videos, something that actually really brings that child back down and that helps them to relax. Or it might be going for a walk, or it might be engaging in some sort of activity that's kind of down regulating for them. So that might differ depending on the child, but there might be certain activities that help to calm them down and ground them. So those are all strategies that are really helpful at this escalation point. Also really important, and it's really hard as well, because as we said, you're probably going to be trying to escalating at this point, even if you're not showing it, but really trying to model to your child about how to manage this distress and how to calm back down. So if you can stay calm, even if you're not feeling it inside, you're really showing to that child, like, it's okay, you're safe, I'm going to keep you safe, I'm going to be able to manage your distress. You're really sending out those signals, even if you're not aware of it. And also, I guess, just thinking a little bit about the environment, actually, if is the environment around the child calm and quiet? Actually, if it's really noisy, really busy, they're probably going to keep escalating. So can you direct them to somewhere that's a bit quiet, even if it's just for a kind of short amount of time? And can you remove any demands? Actually, do you need to do that thing right there, right now? Can you break it down maybe into smaller steps rather than making it one big request? Can you do it together? So there's lots of different things that can be helpful at that stage. And I guess another thing to kind of mention as we start to go up this volcano, and this is the same for all of us, we said that kind of bit of our brain that handles being able to understand language, that is able to plan, to problem solve, just to even think, starts to go more and more offline. So the language that we are able to understand as we escalate up this volcano becomes more reduced. So actually we need to use less verbal language. We need to use shorter sentences. We might even need to use more visuals or more signs at this point, because lots of verbal instructions, it's going to be too much to process, and that ability is just not going to be online. So we really need to be making sure we're using shorter sentences, more simple language, more gestures, and so maybe even some kind of symbols at this point.
Yeah. So then the next stage is the reactive strategies. And this is what we call for when we're in a meltdown. We're at the top of that volcano and the emotions are just overflowing, and that's where we see the most of the challenging behaviour. And the most important thing at this stage is to make sure everyone's kept safe, or as safe as they can be. So this is ensuring that you and your child and any other children or anyone else in the environment are safe. They may have to move away into a separate room at times. And it also links in with the previous, those secondary strategies, thinking about removing all demands from that environment. So allowing them a space to slowly but surely come back down to that baseline without asking them to either do an activity or do something else straight away, and putting that demand straight back on that child, just allowing them that time and that space to come back down to that baseline if they can. And you might have to help a lot with this as well. So think about those secondary strategies. You have to be there, you have to be quite accepting and empathetic to your child, and especially afterwards when they're in that sort of post-incident dip. They may be feeling very sorry, and it's really important that their apology is accepted. This doesn't mean that you're accepting the behaviour itself. It just means that you're accepting the child's apology at that time, because all the child needs at that point is likely going to be connecting with you, and that attachment and that reassurance that everything's going to be okay. And here we have this idea around trying not to discipline your child or correct your child. Remember that they've just sort of flipped their lid, and actually they probably aren't really thinking about what they're doing because they can't have access to those higher brain thoughts. And it's more about connecting with your child before correcting. So often this feels like we're asking you to accept the behavior and accept that that's okay, but we're not. What we're trying to say is actually just providing your child with that connection, that love and that attachment that you can provide, and that safety, until they are in that sort of baseline, until they are fully regulated again, until their lid has come back down, so they're able to connect the thoughts together. And that's the point at which we then look at sort of some of that correction stuff. And then in terms of that correcting the behavior, focus on what you'd rather see that child do instead of what they handled badly. And then think about repairing that relationship potentially as well. So what might have happened is they might have hit out at you or someone else. And actually what they need at that stage is to know that you still love them and you still care for them, even though the action maybe wasn't what you wanted to see. You're still there for them. And just try not to go over the behavior all the time. So provide them with things like a hug if that's what they need at that time. Provide them with some language saying that actually you still care for them, you're still there for them regardless of what happens, and just sort of repair that relationship and bring it together.
And often that's the time. So I guess now we're talking a little bit about this kind of post-incident strategy rather than, I guess, the reactive escalation stuff. This is a time for you to be curious about what might have been going on for your young person, and helping them make some of those links about what they might have been feeling and what happened. So you might suggest something like, I wonder whether this happened because you were really, really tired, or I wonder if you did this because you didn't want to go to school. So you're helping the child make some of those links between kind of the function, the behavior that they might not have the skills to do themselves. So it's just some of that curiosity as to what might have been going on, understanding why that might have happened, and helping the child make some of those links.
And you know your children the best. So actually, when we think about some of these strategies, you probably have quite a good idea about some of those, especially those fast triggers, or especially if the child doesn't like going to school, or if they're feeling unwell, you can probably tell when they're not feeling right. And this is a good chance for you to bring in that knowledge that you have and say, I wonder, is it because of whatever idea you might have? And to allow the child to have that connection themselves and make that link between the behavior and what the function is, alongside you, rather than simply just telling them what it might be.
Mm-hmm. And we mentioned this a lot, but what every child needs at all of these different points is going to be really, really different. And for some children, actually, they really might need you there to be with them and help them feel safe, and other children actually might need time and space to calm down, and you being there actually is too overwhelming and too distressing. And often I've had this conversation with parents where they feel like they're being a bad parent because they're letting their child be alone in their distress. That's what it feels like. But then they'll say to me, but if I go and try and comfort them, they'll hit out at me, or they become more distressed, they'll tell me to go away. And it feels like a real bind, because they want their child's distress and they want to offer that support and want to be with them. But actually what that child needs is time and space to calm down, to come back down to baseline on their own. So often that might just be giving that child space, but maybe staying where you can see them, or if that's even too much for the child, then maybe just coming back and checking periodically, or giving the child a way that when they've come back down towards baseline, that they can tell you it's okay, and actually then they need that connection from you. But it's just something I've often had discussions with parents about, feeling guilty for letting their child be upset and kind of managing on their own, whereas actually that's what that child needs at that moment, and that connection and being together can come just a little bit later down that behaviour volcano.
Yeah. So I think now is a good time to have a quick break. I think we are running a little bit behind time, so if we can come back around 25 to 12.
It's 25 to 12.
I meant quarter to 12. That's what I meant. And yeah, stretch your legs, take a step away from the screen, grab yourself a cup of tea or coffee in that time, and then yeah, we'll see you at quarter to, if that's okay.
So we hope you had a good quick break, and we're just going to be coming back for hopefully just the last 15 minutes now, to just chat a little bit more just about a few other things that we think are helpful, thinking about strategies. And yeah, so we're hoping to finish on time at 12 o'clock, and hopefully maybe have a few minutes just for any questions that you might have. But yeah, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is something called P.A.C.E, and we've alluded to this actually in some of the things that we've talked about so far when thinking about strategies. And P.A.C.E is it's hard to describe it. It's a way of being. It's kind of an attitude and a stance that you can take in your kind of conversations and your relationships, not just with your child, but actually kind of with anyone that you're with. And P.A.C.E is an acronym because we love an acronym, and it stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. And it comes from something called dyadic developmental psychotherapy, called DDP, which is a very long, complicated name, but is a therapy that came out of work with looked after children, particularly thinking about how we foster attachments and relationships. But we find that P.A.C.E is really helpful with children with lots and lots of different needs, and even our own relationships. And it's said kind of about that parenting in the moment, so how we are with our child through all those different stages of behaviour that challenge. So the P stands playfulness, and this is about kind of creating an atmosphere of lightness and interest when you're interacting with each other. It's kind of like using a light tone in your voice rather than maybe being more irritated or a more lecturing tone. It's about kind of having fun and expressing just a sense of joy from interacting with the other person, with the child. This isn't necessarily about kind of playing games or necessarily always being silly. And actually, there's going to be times where playfulness isn't as appropriate. So when someone's at that crisis point, probably playfulness isn't appropriate at that point. But actually, kind of when you're in baseline, those day-to-day situations, really when someone's starting to escalate, just kind of having that lightness and that interest and that kind of more joyful kind of stance when you're talking with your child can be helpful then. Acceptance is about just kind of accepting the child's emotions and understanding where that behaviour might be coming from. It's not about accepting the behaviour, but it's just accepting that that is how that child's feeling right now, that that child has flipped their lid, that they're trying to communicate in the best way that they know how, that they don't feel safe, or that they're unhappy, or that they're dysregulated. I said that curiosity, so that's something that I had mentioned earlier about kind of helping that child reflect on what might be going on inside. So might think about those thoughts or those emotions, thinking about the reasons behind that, and kind of offering that as a suggestion to them. So curiosity saying, oh, I wonder if you felt this, or I wonder if this happened because of this, because they may not be able to do it themselves. So we're just curiously suggesting or offering ideas for what might be going on. And then the final point is about empathy. And this is just about having that compassion, letting the child feel your compassion for them, and that you understand how they feel and their emotions, and that you will be with them in those hard times and in those hard feelings, and you'll provide them comfort and support through all those really big emotions. And we said there's different times when these might be more appropriate, and particularly when we're in that crisis point, we're focusing on that acceptance and that empathy. So really understanding where that behaviour is coming from, that they flip their lid, that they can't do anything about it, and empathizing with how they feel. As you said, this isn't about accepting the behaviour, but just that you can understand where that's coming from. And P.A.C.E is something that takes a long time to kind of get used to and do, but it's just something to think about and see whether there are opportunities where you can incorporate this into your interactions with your child.
And then that leads us on to what we refer to as the parenting sandwich, which is something I really love. It's all about like how to set boundaries. So we like to think of it as step one being the top of that button. And that's how we attune to our child. That's how we use, once again, thinking about that empathy again and building up those connections and building up that relationship and to communicate and understanding of what is happening for them. So as John was saying, I wonder if it is this that's happening for you. I wonder, is it because you're really tired, or is it because you don't like school? So really getting in contact with your child's needs and their emotions and coming alongside your child as that top of that button. And then we have the fill-in as step two. So these are the boundaries. So remaining calm and warm and sympathetic, but also being clear about what the boundary is. So what is and what isn't allowed, and the consequences. So think about like, if someone does this, then this happens. And it's really important to avoid that anger. So actually, we want to think about accepting that child, being empathetic with that child when they're at a crisis point. Once they've re-regulated themselves, making it clear to them that actually some of the behaviours weren't what is accepted in the family, what's accepted and isn't allowed, and then think about the consequences for afterwards. And then step three, the safe base, that bottom of that sandwich. And this is what we always come back to, this is the repair. So making sure the child knows that they are still loved and you are still there for them and you still care for them. And actually they're not a bad child. It's simply that their behavior is bad or wrong at that stage. And your relationship is always strong and will always be there for them. And everyone's allowed to make mistakes. We all make mistakes at times, but they are still loved and they still have that safe base, that sandwich. No one wants a soggy bottom to their sandwich that falls apart. We always want that safe base of repair to come back to.
And thinking about how we kind of get a child to maybe kind of do the things that we want them to do and not kind of engage in those behaviours that aren't acceptable. We really want to be focusing with a child on what we want them to do, rather than just repeatedly punishing them or telling them off for what they're doing wrong. So thinking about trying to reward the positives, their strengths and their successes. So sometimes ways of doing this can be reward charts. Rewards don't necessarily need to be things like money or getting things. Sometimes it can involve praise, telling the child that you really like what they're doing. And there are different ways of doing that. And I think we have some more information about reward charts. So if that's something that feels helpful, we can always include that in, there's a pack that we send out following this webinar. We can make sure that that's included, so there's some extra information in there. And so, yeah, we're really just trying to focus on rewarding that behaviour that we want to see, rather than focusing on what they're doing wrong.
Yeah. And then we come into this idea of self-care and recognising that you have feelings too. So when your child is on that sort of volcano on stage 3 or 4, like when they're about to explode or in that meltdown stage of exploding, where are you on your volcano? Chances are you're going to be off baseline, because it's going to be upsetting and really like quite stressful to see your child quite upset at that time. But even when your child's coming back down, you might still be feeling very stressed and upset about it, because those aren't behaviours that you want to see, and that might have caused a lot of distress at that time. And it can mean that we are really hard on ourselves and we really struggle to use some of the acceptance of ourselves. We want to accept our child and accept that those behaviours aren't okay, but still have that unconditional acceptance of our child. And we still might be able to empathise and really understand the emotional state of your child, but we really struggle to do that for ourselves. And it's always good to remember that you are doing your best. We cannot get it right all the time. It's absolutely impossible. And just like we accept children making mistakes, we also make mistakes, and that's okay. It's completely fine to make mistakes. And it's just make sure that you recognize where you are at that time as well.
And it's thinking about, in the same way that we've thought about calming strategies for your child, what's some of your calming strategies? So what things do you need to do in that moment to bring yourself back down so that you can be a safe base for your child? So actually, do you need to do some deep breaths yourself? Is there a way you need to regulate your own breathing? Do you need to walk away for a moment, for 5 minutes, for a minute, to just allow your lid to kind of come back down so that you can handle this situation? Because actually, if both of your lids are flipped, then nothing helpful, no strategy is going to be able to be put in place, because you're both going to be reacting off those emotions, that fight, flight, that freeze response. So just having a bit of a think about what you might need, what works for you to kind of bring yourself back down so that you can handle that, because as you said, you need to be able to there to do lots of this for your child. So you need to be in a space to be able to do that as well. So sometimes you need to put that first. Obviously you need to keep people safe, but sometimes that might need to come first in order to do that for your child.
And so that what leads us to think about, what do you do for yourself for self-care? This is lovely quotes from the author Audre Lorde, who says, "I have come to believe that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. Caring for myself is an act of survival." And we've probably all heard this idea of you can't pour from an empty jug. I think, as Jordan was saying there, if you flipped your lid, if you are off baseline and up like this and can't even think and can't use those higher sort of brain skills, then it's going to be really difficult to help a child do that as well. So if we can go to Menti and type in the same code, you should be able to see the next section where you can put in about what you do for self-care. So I'll just share that. And these can be any strategies at all, but often it's really good to see what other people are doing, because we all have different strategies at this time. So for some of us, it might be sit on the sofa, binge watching our favorite TV show. It might be having a cup of tea or coffee and maybe a piece of chocolate or something like that. For other people, it might be some of the sort of mindfulness breathing and different things, completely different for everyone.
And we'll just wait and see if people feel like sharing some of these. And they don't have to be big things. So actually, even just something, like you said, walking away and having 5 minutes when you feel like you're going to blow up, that is self-care. Trying to get good sleep, exercise, a good diet, those are all things that contribute to kind of self-care. I think often people think that it has to be something big that you go and do, or I'm going to have a nice bath and do all this self-care stuff. Actually, it can be really small things. We've got some stuff coming in here now that people do. So going out with friends, having people around you in your community that you can talk to and share some of those feelings, those emotions, and also actually to think about other things, that other parts of your lives as well, I think is really important. Talking with partner as well, making sure that you're coming together to share the load. Often when we work with families, we're trying to bring both parents on board. So not just one is feeling the load, but you're both in it together and you're both sharing that difficulty together. Or some other really good examples here. So chocolate, yeah, definitely. That would be my self-care too. Having a cup of tea, a glass of wine, yeah. Doing some exercise, actually getting some endorphins, getting some of your own stress hormones out of the body. Having quiet time, I think really important, just time to reflect, be on your own, relax, going for a walk in nature, having a bath.
We've also got hugs there, as we said earlier, when children are coming down and maybe going to that post instant dip, that actually what they need there is a hug. But actually a lot of the time we also need that human connection, that hug, to make us feel safe and cared for in that moment. So there's a really great range of different self-care techniques here and ideas of how we take care of ourselves, which are really important. We can see how varied they are. And as John was saying, like it can be anything from a 30-second breather to actually going out and having time with friends or watching your favorite TV show. It can be something really distinct or it can be really quite small as well.
And I guess the message that we're just trying to get across is that how important it is to have this embedded within your life. As important as those strategies are to manage challenging behaviour, this is just as important, but obviously this gets neglected, and quite often we have people say, well, I just don't have time for self-care. But actually it's so important to help you be in that place to be able to respond in the best way to your child. So helping think about when you might be able to fit just even small parts of this into your day is really important, just as important as anything else we've spoken about so far.
Yeah. So we go on to back to the slides now, just for the last couple of slides. So when we think about services and resources out there, there are quite a few different resources that parents can access if they feel like they need it at that time. So we've got Cardiff Family Gateway, who provide a great range of free advice and signposting for families in Cardiff. They also have different pathways to referrals to specialist services as well. So there's a bunch of ways of contacting them there.
There is a Vale equivalent, which I think we were meant to add in after the last time we did this, yes, and we forgot. So we will add the contact details for the Vale family, I can't remember the name of it, system or service, so that if there's anyone here who's from the Vale, there's the information about that as well. So when we send this out, so we're sending out a pack of some resources and the PowerPoint to you once this webinar's done. We'll make sure that we pop that in as well. Obviously, you know, you've also got your GP and emergency services. So obviously, you know, we're here as well as the community family psychology team, but we're not a crisis team. We don't do out of hours work. So if you have real concerns about your child's safety, your own safety, someone else, obviously GP out of hours, A&E, calling 999, obviously there is your emergency helplines as well.
Yeah. So thank you for taking part. We've got one last thing for Mentimeter to just quickly look at, if possible, if everyone has time, because I know we've run a little bit over time. So let's bring that back up. If anyone has any questions at all or wants to stay for a bit longer to ask any questions, then just pop them in the chat and we're happy to answer them as well.
So we're just asking you to rewrite the statements that you answered at the beginning and be as truthful as possible, because this helps us think a little bit about the next time we run this webinar for other parents, what we could change or what might be helpful. So just, yeah, take some time to do that. And so if you've got any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat.
So one of the questions we had there was around how useful or how helpful it might be for a child to be bored at times. So sometimes it might be, it might help the child learn to problem solve for themselves and think about what to do for themselves. And that can be really helpful. But if a child has some additional learning needs or anything similar to that, it might be really useful to actually have a plan of things to do in the day that they can go back to all the time. And even during that time, they might want to not engage with that activity, and that's fine. And they might just sit there and be by themselves and think to themselves and think about what they want to do, and they might change those activities. But it can always be good to actually make sure that they have something to do. And if that is the function of the behavior, if they are acting in a way or using behavior to be able to get an activity or to do something, then that's a really good indicator that we need to put in new strategies and new plans for what to do for them.
And for some children, actually, it might just be teaching them a way of communicating when they're done with kind of that time of being bored. So how can they tell you, actually, okay, like now I've had enough of this and I want to do something. We just really need to think about, for children with learning disabilities who we might be working with, that we might need to scaffold some of these things more than we might need to for other children, because it takes a lot longer for some of that development to happen. So we might need to put some more things in place and help children do some of this a bit more, because they may not develop those skills to do it themselves quickly. as perhaps other children without additional needs might. So next question was kind of around calmly dealing with the same behaviours over and over again when you've not got time to yourself through respite. And I think this is something that we often see a lot with the families that we support, is struggling to get respite and dealing with the same behaviours over and over again. And I guess this is where some of that self-care stuff comes in, about trying to find small pockets of your day where you can do things to look after yourself. And thinking about, I guess, acknowledging that this is really hard and that actually it's going to be really difficult to deal with the same things over and over again, and kind of giving yourself permission to be like, this is really, really difficult. What I said, we are also, and this I guess kind of answers the next question as well. So we do work with families with children with learning disabilities, and you can be referred to us through your kind of health professional. So like your paediatrician, for example, can make a referral to us if you're struggling with behaviours that challenge and you've strategies that you tried aren't working. A referral can be made to us, and we if we accept a referral and we get top of our waiting list, we will work with the family to think about what is going to be most helpful for them. And actually for some families that will be doing kind of like a PBS approach. Other families might not need a full PBS plan, and we might work on something differently, or they might just need a short-term piece of work, and sometimes actually it's just advice. But I guess, yeah, in terms of getting in contact with our service, it's a referral either kind of through paediatrician, or it might be OT, speech and language, or even social worker as well, can all make referrals to us. And I think there's information on our website a little bit about us and what we do if you want more information. And so we'll be sending out a few resources alongside this kind of the PowerPoint from today to everyone who's attended. I don't know if there's any more kind of last minute questions. If not, we'll let people head off because we know it's lunchtime and we said we'd be here till 12. So if there isn't anything else, we just want to say thank you for attending today and interacting with us. It's always a bit odd doing a webinar because obviously we can't see anyone or really get any responses. We're just kind of talking to a screen and hoping that you're gaining something from it. So thank you for using the chat, and thank you for using and engaging with the Mentimeter, because it just gives us some sign that there's someone there. And we hope this has been helpful and just given a brief introduction to understanding behaviours that challenge, and there's something that you've been able to take away from today that you maybe didn't know before and that might be helpful for you moving forward with the children that you have and that you support.
Yeah, thank you very much for everyone attending and giving us this time today. Yeah, hopefully it's useful, and we'll send out that pack of information as well.
One last question.
Oh, there is one last question. Oh, it says thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Much appreciated.
Everyone have a good rest of your day. Thanks a lot.